Hello and welcome to the sermon for this weekend. We are approaching the time of year we call Easter, and we've been considering in our sermons so far Jesus' pathway to the Passover, at which time he will sacrifice himself. But as we have been going through the Revised Common Lectionary, we've been looking at the life of Jesus, and I like to ask the question, this sort of makes sense of it for me, where was Jesus right now? What was he doing? And so as we approach this coming week, which is traditionally called Holy Week, and we'll explain that in just a moment, I ask the question, where was Jesus and what was he doing about now? And as we look into the activities he was involved in and the decisions he made, we realize that Jesus took a very strategic approach to his personal sacrifice. He emotionally and spiritually prepared his disciples ahead of time. He steeled his own nerves to face the coming trial. And for quite some time, he's been postponing the inevitable, because as he faces the establishment of the day, they become more determined to resist him, and eventually they decide they have to destroy him as far as they are concerned. They want to take his life. And so Jesus, knowing this, does not put himself in harm's way until the moment that he chooses. Up until this time, immediately before Holy Week, he's been spending most of his time in the north, away from Jerusalem, the center of resistance. And now it is time of Passover, and the entire nation is on the move. In one way or another, as many people as can make it are coming to Jerusalem. And Jesus is leaving the north, the Galilee, where he has grown up in Nazareth, in the north end of the Galilee, which is referred to in the prophets as Galilee of the Gentiles. It's as if he's right on the edge of the nation, and the area almost belongs to the world, which of course Jesus does belong to the world and came to serve the world, so that's kind of appropriate. But now we see him traveling from the north down to the south, which was a very typical pilgrimage that the inhabitants of that area would make, coming down the Jordan Valley, the Jordan Rift, getting to that area where if we just turn west, we'll move into Jerusalem, and then we will travel up the ascending highway from Jericho to Jerusalem. And as they make that journey, of course, which takes a day or so, they typically would sing the Psalms of Degrees. There would be songs that they would all know, and they would sing. And as they approached Jerusalem, they would be rejoicing, because this is where God has his temple. This is where God has his dwelling place. And they have come to make sacrifice at the Passover season. This is a great privilege. And of course, even to this day, Jews who will celebrate the Passover around the world will express the hope next year in Jerusalem. Next year in Jerusalem. And so Jesus, being a devout Jew and fulfilling the law in every aspect, in every point, perfectly, is coming to Jerusalem and presenting himself in the temple at Passover time. And so we see him traveling south and now west into Jericho. And there are quite a lot of people coming along with him, because after all, he's very popular in the north. Who wouldn't be popular? If you can feed the 5,000 with a couple of bran muffins and a couple of sardines, if you heal the sick, raise the dead, and speak in glowing terms of God's love for his people, and the assumption that follows is that you are going to, as the promised son of David, restore the glory of the kingdom, then why wouldn't you be popular? And of course, the people in the north aren't particularly devoted to the cult of the Pharisees. They tolerate the Sadducees because they're the priests. Some of us up here are zealots. We want to see the glory of our nation restored. We want the Romans to be thrust out. And isn't that what our promised Messiah will do for us? Well, they don't exactly understand his ministry and his purpose. But here he is now leading an enthusiastic group of people south. And among them, of course, he himself and his disciples. And as they come to the area of Jericho, they turn and they prepare at what will be the start of this Holy Week to ascend up to Jerusalem. And in a day or two, it will be the first day of the week, Sunday, which we refer to as Palm Sunday. And now, as we look at this map, we realize that Jerusalem is on our way, and just to the east of Jerusalem is Bethany. Bethany we know about because we discussed it a couple of weeks ago, is the home of Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and that's where Jesus will make camp. Where the rest of the crowd will be, we don't quite know, but we know from the scriptures, and I'm going to be bouncing back and forth as I try to harmonize some of the thoughts from the gospel accounts today. We know from Mark 10 and verse 32, now they were on their way to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking along ahead, and as the disciples were following, they were filled with terror and dread. Why would the disciples be feeling this in the pit of their stomach? Well, they knew Jerusalem was a hotbed of resistance. They had a lot of friends there, but they also had said some weeks before when they came to the house of Lazarus and Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead, they were kind of resigned to the fact that, well, we could be in real mortal danger here. So now they're coming back to Jerusalem, and it says they are filled with terror and dread. So Jesus takes them aside and begins to describe all that was going to happen to him when they arrived at Jerusalem. So Jesus begins to emotionally prepare them. He comforts them. He says, this is my purpose. Now, of course, they can't quite wrap their minds around that, so there are all sorts of things running through their heads at the moment. But we're going to place this at Thursday or Friday before Palm Sunday, because immediately after this, we read that Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. Now, we take this from Luke 19, and we realize that Jesus, on his way to Jerusalem, has to go through Jericho, which is the typical route. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. And we know this story off by heart. He's a fairly short fellow. He climbs a tree, and as the crowd is passing through, Jesus stops, looks up the tree, and says, hey, buddy, come on down. So Jesus knows a lot of people. And whether he knows Zacchaeus by name, or he has spoken with him before, or he's asked him a question when they were gathering around the rabbi to receive instruction, we don't quite know. But either way, Jesus says, hey, buddy, I see you up the tree. I know you're having a difficult time getting any FaceTime with me, so I'll tell you what, come on down. We're going to go to your house and have a meal. And we're very familiar with that story, and it tells us in Matthew now that as he is leaving Jericho and they're walking out together, a vast crowd surges along behind. Now, I take this from the Living Bible. All right, now you may not get this from the King James, but the Living Bible renders it a vast crowd surging along behind. And that really captures the moment, because Jesus is arriving with an enthusiastic group of followers from the north. They're going to Jerusalem, a totally different ambiance there. Yeah, a lot of people like Jesus, but let's remember the cult of the priesthood, the cult of the Sadducees, dominates there. And their buddies, the Pharisees, hold sway there. But as Jesus is leaving Jericho, it tells us two blind men are sitting beside the road. And when they heard that Jesus was coming that way, they began shouting, Sir, King David's son, have mercy on us. Or as other translations will say, Son of David, have mercy upon us. Now, this is a highly significant phrase. Because to be the promised son of David was to be the promised deliverer, the Messiah, the Savior. And so when you read commentators or critics that say, well, Jesus didn't take himself that seriously, and he just considers himself a typical fellow, the son of a man, this type of idea. Well, the crowd sees him as the fulfillment of these prophecies, and he doesn't contradict them. And so the blind, knowing that this crowd are surging around them, hearing the people yell their comments, knows full well that everybody perceives this man as the promised Messiah. This is what all the excitement is about. So if the blind can see that, it sort of clues us into the fact that this is a pretty significant movement. And obviously, arriving with a large crowd that believes this is going to be noticed in Jerusalem. And as they leave, we'll skip that to the end of that story. It says they proceed west, ascending towards Jerusalem, and they went to Bethany and Bethphage on the Mount of Olives. And this is within a short walking distance, less than 2 miles of Jerusalem. And the reason I single this out is because this is a sabbatical distance for traveling. In other words, you're not going to have too many people criticizing you for walking into Jerusalem from Bethany, okay? And this is the time, and you can see this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where the disciples borrow a donkey and its colt, so Jesus can ride the colt into Jerusalem. Now, he's going to go to Bethany. He's going to make it his home base for the next week or so, and he's done this numerous times. This is the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, okay? And from here, he is obviously planning his entry. And we see this in John chapter 12 now. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrives at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Now, I show you this because we could say, well, what is 6 days before the Passover? This would place the Passover at about Friday. And this was place Jesus arriving probably on the Sabbath. He can walk a short distance on the Sabbath and not be criticized. And so let's say he arrives, and it's not important. We don't need to go down this rabbit hole of examining this, but let's see he arrives on Friday or Saturday, and it's identified as 6 days before the Passover. And somehow or other, the story of the colt has been introduced, and Jesus is at dinner, perhaps at the end of the day on Sunday at the home of Lazarus. And it tells us in this same context, a few verses later in John 12, that a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. So it's difficult to be at all humorous about this, but you got to see the irony of this. Here they are faced with the reality that Jesus is at the home of Lazarus, and everybody knows Lazarus was raised from the dead. So the chief priests, who have set their minds to defeat Jesus, say that we better take along the evidence of his messiahship as well. We better make sure that we kill Lazarus, put him back in the grave where Jesus took him from. Now, here we have then the ambiance of this situation. Jesus is in Bethany, very close to Jerusalem. His disciples have been dispatched to find this colt, and it says that they borrow this colt from a man who's tethered in the doorway. Now, you might ask, well, why does Jesus want a donkey? Why does he want a new young donkey? Well, it says, as he approaches Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sends 2 of his disciples, saying to them, go to the village ahead of you. As you enter it, you'll find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it to me. Now, the reason that he wants a colt is because he plans to enter Jerusalem on this little donkey. And as he enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, it clearly says, and I'll take this again from the Living Bible, this is going to be done to fulfill the ancient prophecy. Tell Jerusalem her king is coming to her, riding humbly on a donkey's colt. And that prophecy is taken from Zechariah 9 and verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, why would Jesus do that? Well, because as the expression was, nobody rides the king's donkey. Seems odd to us, but it'd be like saying nobody drives dad's car. Only, far more important. Nobody rode on the king's donkey. And so if Jesus asks for a colt that's never been ridden, then he is fulfilling that particular role of a king. Now, if a king comes to conquer, he rides a horse. So in Revelation, Jesus is pictured as returning on a horse with a sword. But in this case, he comes humbly to Jerusalem in peace. So he fulfills the prophecy of Zechariah. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem, see your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, or bringing salvation to you. Gentle, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So here he is planning to come, and this is the great event that we call the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday. As he travels straight east from Bethany into Jerusalem, entering through the Golden Gate, he travels up and over the Mount of Olives. It tells us in Luke 19, then the crowd spread out their robes along the road ahead of him. And as they reached the place where the road started down from the Mount of Olives, and of course he would be passing by the graves of the prophets as he did so, the whole procession begins to shout and sing as they walked along, praising God for all the wonderful miracles Jesus had done. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said, "Hey, teacher, rebuke your disciples." Of course, they feel threatened. Not only threatened, they are aghast that he is fulfilling these prophecies, that the people are shouting and singing along, praising God for Jesus' wonderful works. And he continues on. He enters into the temple confines through the Golden Gate. And we see this is one of the, as he's approaching, it says as he comes over the Mount of Olives and he pauses, and he saw the city, he wept over it and said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. So here he comes as the Prince of Peace, and they just don't want to see it. In fact, as we referred a moment ago, perhaps it's the end of this particular day, back in Bethany over dinner, that they decide, well, we got to kill him for sure now, and we better make sure we include Lazarus. And Jesus, as he weeps over Jerusalem, says, the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. And of course, that does happen during the lifetime of the disciples. The apostles lived to see the siege of Jerusalem. When, as Luke also reports, Jesus predicts, when you see armies surrounding Jerusalem, then know the destruction thereof is close. As Jesus says of his prophecies, which he gives a few days later, this generation will not pass until you see this happen. He continues with his statement in this context, they will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. And again, if we read these words, Jesus states of himself that this is the time of God's coming. Now, I guess you could waffle around that and say, well, he doesn't really think he's God. And of course, in light of all the other statements where he says bluntly, the Father and I, we are one, it's clear that he knows that he is God in the flesh. So when the critics say that there's no evidence of that, well, you can look for yourself, see in the text what is reported, and conclude that Jesus knows who he is and what he is doing. Now, as we have seen on Palm Sunday, The people are rejoicing. The people are calling their hosannas, which means bless him. He is the Savior, things like that. And we realize that he is standing there, or I beg your pardon, sitting on the donkey, weeping over Jerusalem because he sees them about to reject him wholesale. And he has already told his disciples, my crucifixion is near. And these are the events of Palm Sunday. And it tells us, as he enters Jerusalem, he goes to the temple. Then he entered the temple and began to drive out the merchants from their stalls. Now, before you get too far down the rabbit hole with this one, realize that there are legitimate reasons why merchants should be there. We have money changers who take the coin of the realm, which is Roman coin, and facilitate changing Roman coin for temple coin. Now, no doubt there is a markup, but the point is you can't bring Roman coins into the temple with the visage of the emperor on them. The emperor is the god of the empire. So you're literally carrying a graven image of another god. So you can't bring that into God's temple. And when you do come into the temple, you just can't bring any old animal that you happen to think is okay. It has to be a temple, I beg your pardon, an approved animal, approved for the temple by the temple priests. So there is a legitimate reason for people to be there, but they have encroached into that area, Solomon's porches on the south area, where rabbis are supposed to teach and preach, where people can gather to pray. And they've just taken over the whole area. So Jesus pushes them back, drives them back. John reports early at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, several years before this event, that Jesus had to do the same. He just couldn't come in and find a ready place to set up as a rabbi and begin to teach. So he had to push them back, and he pushes them back again here. To make a space, he has to jostle for space. It's like sort of a Black Friday sale in there, and the regular people can't get to the merchandise. The disciples can't get to their rabbis because the sellers of animals have encroached into the area meant for teaching. The idea that Jesus ran around the 20 acres of the Temple Mount, flailing away with a whip, looking like a madman, is kind of a little bit off for me. Jesus has a legitimate reason to push back and say, hey, clean this place out. And it tells us the blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. This is a very public display of miraculous power. He didn't act quite this way at the beginning of his ministry, but now the gloves are off. And as he heals the blind and the lame, clearly the message is this individual, this rabbi, has more power than all the priests put together. So when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple area, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. Why? Well, Hosanna meant save him, adore him. And it means he is our Savior. He is the one who brings salvation. So bless him. And he is the Son of David. Oh, who is the Son of David? He is the one who will come to restore us. And of course they're indignant. And so he is cleansing the temple, is the title we give this, and he is establishing a place for God, which of course there hasn't been a place for God up until this point, because it's been dominated by Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, the following day, it tells us, and we'll tag this day as Monday, Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So he came in and he left. But Matthew tells us it's early in the morning. As he was on his way back to the city, he was hungry. So perhaps this is Tuesday now. But either way, he's traveling back in, and he sees a fig tree by the road. He went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, may you never bear fruit again. And immediately the tree withered. So Perhaps Sunday is his entering into Jerusalem, looking around, and then going back to Bethany. And of course, the other details we've just filled in would perhaps suggest that he is there for a short time. Perhaps then we could say the Monday morning he makes an early start, traveling in. He sees a fig tree and he says, "Hey, you're not producing anything. We're going to curse you." Now, this is significant because one of the many symbols for Israel is my vine, Israel is my fruitful vine, my fig tree, things like that. And so when Jesus sees this and he curses the fig tree, as it's traditionally said, and it withers, well, there's something to be said about that. Let's flip over to chapter Mark 11, chapter 11 and verse 15. On reaching Jerusalem, after the fig tree incident, Jesus entered the temple. He begins driving out those who are buying and selling. He overturns a few tables belonging to money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations? You've made it into a den of robbers," because, of course, they aren't exactly doing all of this without a price. And now in doing this, Jesus interferes with trade. So the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this, began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. When evening came, they went out of the city. So the teaching and the disruption of business is a frustration. The next day, let's call this Tuesday, in the morning as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Hey, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed is withered." And Jesus responds, "Have faith in God. I tell you the truth, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and doesn't doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him." And so now we begin to realize that Jesus is showing them that, yes, the beautiful thing that was Israel is no more. The opportunity for them to bring light to the world is passing, and it is going to be your opportunity. And so he continues now to enter into the temple, and we have reports in Matthew 21, Luke 20, of him teaching and debating in the temple. And as he leaves the temple, and this of course becomes now the very famous Matthew 24, it tells us he leaves the temple on this particular day, probably Tuesday, maybe Wednesday. Jesus leaves the temple and is walking away, and his disciples come up to him to call his attention to the buildings. Now, this particular incident is interesting to us because we know that Herod has contributed a great deal of money. Herod is the king of the Jews, but he's not a Jew. He's in fact descended from the line of Esau, and he is called an Idumean. And so he actually belongs to the branch of the family. He's that branch of the family, the cousins, who feel that their cousins, the Jews, have displaced them from the promised land. And so he rules and is very aware that he's just a politically appointed king. In fact, it was Antony and Cleopatra who got him appointed. And now he's ruling, but he's very insecure. And so he reinforces the Masada, the fortress at Masada. He builds the Herodium, and he has other places where he can flee for safety if the Jews ever turn against him. But one of the smart things he did, because he was a great builder, was he contributed to the Jews enough money to expand the temple. And this is very impressive, and this work is going on, and construction is still happening. And so as Jesus leaves the temple, his disciples say to him, "Hey, come over and look and see what happens." As he leaves the temple, is walking away, his disciples come to him to call his attention to the buildings. And of course, they are impressed. Look what's happened over the last few weeks. They put some of these monstrous stones in place, and things are even more attractive than they were a few months ago. And as they are leaving, and they point this out to Jesus, he said, essentially, don't be too impressed. Not one stone will be left on top of another. You remember that very famous incident. And so they begin walking back, and they've gone a quarter mile or so. They stop. It's still a warm part of the day. And as they stop and sit down to rest, they can't resist but asking Jesus, hey, what did you mean by that? As Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples come to him quietly and privately and say, tell us, when will this business happen? What will be the sign of your coming? What will be the end of the age? And then Jesus goes into a long discussion about what it will be like for them and their generation to live to see the destruction of the temple. And so, in a very sensitive way, he's preparing them emotionally for what they are going to go through. He's also preparing them intellectually. You need to understand when you see the armies gathering around Jerusalem, and the siege is moving in, and you better leave. You should leave. Don't push your luck any further. Get out of there. And so he prepares them intellectually, the facts, what they're going to face in their generation. He prepares them emotionally. You know, this is what's going to happen. And then, of course, the big question, what about the end of the age? Well, a little bit later in that prophecy, it gets to be pretty vague. And he doesn't say to them, well, you can depend on this when you see Russia linking up with Iran, and when you see the United States sending troops into the Middle East or pulling them out, things like that. He doesn't say that. He says, no, let me teach you the important thing to know about the end of the age. It'll be, since I'm going away, like 10 bridesmaids. And the job is to just wait for the bridegroom to come. And so you're going to have to wait. We call that the parable of the 10 virgins. It's going to be like the king who leaves and leaves talents behind. Some people have 1 talent, some people 3 talents, some people 5 talents. And when the king comes back, he's simply going to ask what you do with the talent I gave you. And it's going to be like the one who will come back and find that, okay, the sheep have been left a little while here, and they've mingled with the herd of goats. And that doesn't make a lot of sense to us because we could recognize sheep from goats. If you've ever been in the Middle East, you'll notice you can't tell at a distance any difference between the sheep and the goats. They're both small, they're both kind of wrangly, and they both have black hair. And I never thought of sheep in that particular way, but just once in my life I slept out in the Sinai desert. That's just a little ways from Eilat. And in the morning, a Bedouin girl came up with her herd of sheep, and they looked very much. They looked very. They looked very much like a group of goats to me, black goats. Couldn't tell the difference. And so that's something that you learn as you begin to realize in its time and place that people knew about those things. He says, yeah, the sheep and the goats mingle up at a distance you can't quite tell. So Jesus, when he talks about the end of the age, gives them this insight. Doesn't give them dates, times. In fact, he specifically says, no man knows the day or the hour. This is where your mind should be. And with those parables, we receive instructions. And when Jesus had finished all these things, he said to the disciples, as you know, the Passover is 2 days away. The Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Wow. That's, again, pretty heavy. It also tells us that the Passover, and in this particular case, it begins to shape up. It's going to be on a Friday. The Passover day, when the lambs will be slaughtered. and of course the Passover day, when the lambs are slaughtered, then you have to take that lamb back to your home. You have to roast that lamb, and it takes quite a while to roast a whole lamb. And it's going to be eaten by Jewish tradition somewhere around 9:10 in the evening. And so there's a difference between the day that the Passover is slaughtered and the night to which that meal belongs. So Jesus is referencing the day, in fact, the afternoon, when the Passover lambs will be slaughtered. And then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. And they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way and kill him. But not during the feast, not during the time of the unleavened bread, they're saying, or there will be a riot among the people. And so the timing becomes a little more clear as we put this together, comparing one gospel account with the other. Of course, Jesus is on his way back home to Bethany during the time of this Olivet prophecy. And while Jesus is in Bethany in the home of the man named Simon the leper for a meal, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price, and the money given to the poor." Well, kind of logical if you think about it. If you think about it as we might think about it. But not very logical at all if you have the view from which God is looking at it. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She's done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you'll not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial." I'll tell you the truth. Wherever this gospel, this good news is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. So once again, he prepares them for what is going to come. But their minds can't quite fathom this. In fact, one individual really can't fathom this. He thinks, a lot like the other zealots, I suppose, that, you ought to be a lot more active turning the people's minds against Rome. And of course, Judas, it says, one of the 12, Judas Iscariot, he decides, look, we need to push this along a little bit. We need to inspire the master to stand up and resist the establishment and lead the zealots. Whatever's running through his mind, and by the way, he doesn't agree with this whole business of letting people waste expensive perfume. And so he goes to the chief priests and says, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 silver coins. And Judas begins watching for an immediate opportunity to hand Jesus over. And this would be Tuesday sometime. And on Wednesday, we'll say, Jesus continues teaching. And it tells us each day Jesus was teaching at the temple. Each evening he went out to spend the night on the hill called the Mount of Olives. And all the people came early in the morning to hear him at the temple. And this is sort of a summary of what's been happening for the last few days. And another summary. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. And they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way and kill him. Not during the feast, or there may be a riot among the people. And this, as we discuss the events of this Holy Week, leads us to understand where Jesus' priorities are, what he is preparing to do, which is to offer himself, and what he is preparing to do for us. And also gives us insight as to how he is preparing his disciples to survive the ordeal, equipping them as best they can cope with at this particular time, with the ultimate consideration, even understanding who his betrayer is, steeling himself to go through the Last Supper, steeling his nerves, no doubt, to sit next to Judas. He's close enough, it says, that Judas reaches into the same bowl with him. And then, of course, to wash Judas' feet before he leaves to betray him. And as all these thoughts swirl through your mind, and they swirl through my mind, we realize that Jesus also is with us through whatever particular trials and tests we might be facing this particular Holy Week. We're all going through a difficult time right now. Social distancing is a polite way of saying stay a long way away from me. Lock yourself in your house. I know I went to Costco here the other morning, and didn't matter how early you arrive, you got to stand 6 to 8 feet away from the other person, and you got to wait your turn to go in. And when somebody comes out, you can go in. And this is, of course, just a minor sliver of inconvenience. But Jesus is through these trials with us, these tests with us. And just as he walked with his disciples through this week of preparation, doing what he had to do, but caring for those around him, he still walks with us and cares for us as we walk through this time. And as I think about the abject failure, you might say, on the part of the disciples, because they couldn't go through this trial with him, and as I think about Judas, the one who actually betrays him, and the fact that in a day or so Jesus will have his last supper with them, and he will wash the feet of the one who's going to betray him, then I realize that the number of times I let Jesus down, and the number of times you and I fall short of the high ideals of our Christian faith, nonetheless, his grace is there for us. And so as we consider this week that we're about to live through, perhaps it helps to look at some of the events that are taking place and to see Jesus preparing himself for the trial and tribulation of his crucifixion and also the triumph of his resurrection. And I hope by just taking a few minutes to review some of these thoughts that you too can be comforted and perhaps over the next few days be a little better informed as you ask and answer the question, I wonder where Jesus was right now. I wonder what he was doing. Especially as you consider Palm Sunday, you'll consider his triumphant entry and then the days that follow and the events that will follow in his life. We'll spend a little more time together this week, and hopefully we'll be together for Maundy, Thursday, and we'll have the experience of a Zoom communion service together. But during these difficult times, we will still continue to know that Jesus is with us, walking with us through every step of the way. God bless, take care, and have a thoughtful week as you consider the time between now and Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and what we call the resurrection of Easter Sunday. So, God bless.